There is a voice inside your head that has been talking since before you can remember. It narrates your breakfast. It argues with people who are not in the room. It rehearses conversations that will never happen and replays ones that should have been forgotten years ago. And somewhere along the way, so gradually that you never noticed the moment it happened, you began to believe that this voice is you. But here is what no one ever asks. Not really. Not in a way that actually lands. What happens when it stops? Not when you silence it by force, not when you bury it under music or work or the comfortable noise of other people's problems. When it simply stops, do you disappear with it? Or is that the very first moment you have ever actually been here? Consider for a moment what you actually do when you try to know yourself. You think. You produce more words, more images, more interior commentary about the commentary that was already running. You sit down to meditate, and the voice narrates the meditation. You try to observe your thoughts, and the voice immediately begins describing the observation. You reach for yourself, and what you find every single time is another thought about yourself, never the thing itself. It is rather like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The instrument you are using to search is the very thing you are searching for. And this creates a loop so seamless, so habitual, so thoroughly convincing that most people never notice it is happening at all. Now, I want you to think about what this voice actually does all day. Not the content of it, not what it says, but the function of it. It labels, it categorizes. It takes the raw, unmediated flow of experience and immediately converts it into narrative. The sun on your arm becomes warm afternoon. The sudden tightness in your chest becomes anxiety about tomorrow. The smell of rain on dry earth becomes that smell in the moment you name. It, something of the actual smell, retreats behind the name, like a wild animal stepping back into the trees. Language is extraordinary, you see, but it is also a kind of taxidermy. It preserves the shape of experience while quietly removing whatever was alive in it. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Every culture, every civilization, every mother who has ever raised a child has spent enormous energy teaching that voice to speak. We reward children for narrating correctly, for saying, "I feel angry," instead of simply being the red-faced, fist-clenching creature that anger produces. We teach them to translate raw experience into socially legible sentences. And this is not wrong. Language is how we reach each other across the gap of separate skulls. It is how love is declared and bread is ordered and symphonies are composed. I am not suggesting we abandon it. I am suggesting something much stranger than that. I am suggesting that somewhere in this education, this long, patient, necessary training in self-narration, we made a quiet and consequential mistake. We confused the map for the territory. We took the running commentary to be the thing it was commenting on. We looked at the finger pointing at the moon and decided the finger was the moon. And so now there is this peculiar situation. Millions of people walking around planet Earth, constantly talking to themselves about themselves, utterly convinced that the talking is the self, that if the talking stopped, they would stop, that silence is the same as absence. But is it? What if the silence is not where you end, but where you begin? What if you have been so busy narrating your life that you have not yet had the chance to simply live inside it? I do not ask this to be provocative. Well, perhaps a little. But I ask it because when you actually sit with the question, when you do not rush to answer it, something rather unexpected happens. The question does not produce an answer. It produces a stillness. And in that stillness, something is unmistakably present, awake, aware, curiously untroubled by the fact that it cannot name itself. That presence was here before the first word of this sentence. It will be here after the last. And it has never, not for a single moment, needed the voice to confirm its existence. There is a game the mind plays that is so clever, so thoroughly recursive, that it takes a particular kind of patience to even see it happening. The game goes like this. You notice that you are thinking, and you think about that. You notice that you are thinking about thinking, and you think about that too. You decide to look for the thinker, the one behind all these thoughts, and you produce a thought about the thinker, and then another, and then a thought about whether you are getting closer. At no point in this process does the thinker actually appear. What appears, always and only, is another thought. The searcher is never found because the searcher is always the one doing the finding, and these are not the same direction. David Hume noticed this in the 18th century and had the intellectual honesty to be genuinely disturbed by it. He reported that whenever he entered most intimately into what he called himself, he always stumbled upon some particular perception or other, heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. He never caught himself at any time without a perception, and could never observe anything but the perception. A remarkable confession from a man of such rigorous intellect. He was looking for the self the way you might look for a knot in a piece of string, and discovering that when you unravel the string all the way, there is no special knot substance inside. There is only string all the way down. And yet, and this is the part Hume found so troubling, something was clearly doing the looking. The absence of a findable self did not produce the absence of experience. Quite the opposite. You see, the problem is not that the self does not exist. The problem is that we have been looking for it in entirely the wrong dimension. We have been looking for a noun when the reality is a verb. We have been searching for a fixed object, something that can be pointed at, catalogued, defined, when what we actually are is more like a process, more like weather than a stone, more like a river than the banks that shape it. And you cannot step outside a river to look at the river when you are the flowing of it. You cannot stand apart from the weather to observe the weather when you are the storm itself, thinking. The Zen tradition has a rather beautiful and ruthless way of exposing this. A student approaches the master and says, "Show me my original face, the face I had before my parents were born." Now, this is not a request for biography. It is not asking about genetics or childhood photographs. It is asking, what are you before the story of you begins? Before the name, the nationality, the accumulating catalogue of opinions and preferences and wounds and victories that you carry around and call a personality. And the master does not answer with words, because words are precisely what the question is asking you to go underneath. Any answer given in language would simply add another layer to the very thing the student needs to see through. What the koan does, what it is designed to do, is exhaust the thinking mind. Not defeat it, not humiliate it, not prove it wrong. Exhaust it, like a dog that chases its own tail until it simply lies down, panting, and discovers that lying down was available the whole time. The mind runs at the question from every angle it knows. Logic, memory, imagination, introspection, and every angle leads back to the same impasse. Not because the question is unanswerable, but because the answer is not the kind of thing that fits inside an answer. It is the kind of thing that is already happening while you look for it. It is the looking itself. It is the being that makes the looking possible. And when the mind finally pauses, not in defeat, but in a kind of surprised and quiet surrender, something is still unmistakably here, attentive, present, utterly unconcerned with being named. Let us look very carefully at the question itself. Not to answer it, we've already seen what happens when we try that, but to look at its architecture, to examine the assumptions built into its grammar, the way you might examine the foundations of a house before deciding whether to trust the walls. Because the question, when you stop thinking, do you disappear or appear, contains inside it a picture of the world that we have never actually agreed to, but that we carry around as though it were simply obvious, as though it were the only possible way things could be arranged. The picture goes like this. There is a you. This you exists inside, somewhere behind the eyes, behind the voice, behind the thinking. And there is a world outside, objects, other people, circumstances, that this inner you observes and navigates and occasionally suffers. The thinking is a kind of bridge between the inner you and the outer world. It processes, it interprets, it maintains the connection. And so naturally, so inevitably, given this picture, if the thinking stops, the bridge collapses. The inner you loses its connection to everything. It dissolves, it disappears. This is the fear underneath the question, not an intellectual concern, a visceral, animal terror that silence means annihilation. But now turn the picture over. What if there is no inner you separate from the world? What if the boundary you feel so clearly between yourself and everything else is not a wall but a horizon, something that appears to be fixed and definite but moves with you wherever you go, never actually dividing anything from anything? The skin, after all, does not separate you from your environment. It connects you to it. Every breath is the world moving into you and you moving into the world. Every sensation is the boundary doing what boundaries actually do, not keeping things apart, but marking the place where they meet. You are not a thing inside the universe looking out. You are something the universe is doing. The same way a wave is not a thing inside the ocean, it is something the ocean is doing right there, right now, in that particular shape. And if this is true, even provisionally, even just as an experiment in perception, then when thinking stops, what exactly disappears? The narrator disappears. The commentary disappears. The running self-portrait that thought was continuously painting disappears. But the universe does not stop doing you. The breathing continues. The hearing continues. The extraordinary fact of being a living, sensing, conscious arrangement of the world continues quietly, without announcement, without requiring a single word to validate. What disappears is not you. What disappears is the noise that was covering you. Now here is where language becomes genuinely treacherous, and I want to be careful. Because the moment I say the real you is revealed when thinking stops, I have already done something misleading. I have suggested there is a real you waiting behind the curtain, a more authentic, more essential version of yourself that thought was hiding. And this is another picture, another story, another layer of narration about what happens when narration ceases. The Zen teachers are ruthlessly alert to this. They will not let you replace one concept of self with a more spiritual concept of self and call it liberation. That is simply redecorating the prison. What they point at is something that cannot be captured in any picture at all, not the picture of a separate self, not the picture of a dissolved self merging with the cosmos. Not any picture. The pointing is not toward a better answer. It is toward the place before the question formed. And that place, strange as this sounds, is not somewhere else. It is exactly here. It has always been exactly here. It is simply what remains when you stop insisting that something else should be happening. There is a particular quality of attention that becomes available when the thinking mind goes quiet. Not a blank stupidity, not the dull vacancy of exhaustion or the foggy suspension of sleep. Something much more awake than that. More awake, in fact, than the ordinary busy-minded alertness we mistake for consciousness. It is the kind of attention a cat has when it sits perfectly still by a window, watching the movement of light on a wall. No agenda, no commentary, no part of it wondering whether it is doing the watching correctly. Just this, just the luminous, weightless fact of being present to what is happening. And when you taste that quality of attention, even briefly, even accidentally, in the moment before sleep, or in the suspended instant after a piece of music ends, or in that wordless gap between one thought and the next, you notice something that is very difficult to put back into a box once you have noticed it. You notice that the silence is not empty. This is the thing. This is what the whole elaborate architecture of meditation practice, of contemplative philosophy, of every tradition that has ever asked human beings to be still for a moment, is trying to point at. The silence is not empty. It is, if anything, more full than the noise, the way a clear sky is fuller than a sky cluttered with clouds, not because the clouds added something, but because their absence reveals the depth that was always there. The silence knows, not in the way that thinking knows, not propositionally, not in sentences, not by comparing this to that and drawing conclusions. It knows the way the body knows how to heal a cut without consulting a medical textbook. It knows the way water knows how to find the lowest point, not because it has figured anything out, but because knowing, in this sense, is simply what awareness does when nothing is obstructing it. The Indian philosophical tradition has a word for this ground of silent awareness. They call it chit, pronounced chit, pure consciousness, the fact of being aware prior to any particular content of awareness. And what the Vedantic sages were at such pains to communicate across centuries of elaborate and beautiful argumentation is something almost embarrassingly simple. This awareness is not something you have. It is what you are, not the thoughts arising in it, not the sensations passing through it, not the emotions coloring it, but the awareness itself, the knowing space in which all of that arises and passes and arises again. And this awareness has a rather inconvenient property from the point of view of the thinking mind that wants to own it. It cannot be lost. You cannot misplace awareness. You cannot accidentally leave it in a taxi or have it eroded by age or stolen by circumstance. Every attempt to observe it is itself performed by it. Every doubt about its existence is doubted within it. It is the only thing in your experience that has never, not for a single moment, been absent, because the very recognition of absence happens inside it. And yet, and I find this endlessly amusing, we spend our lives anxious about losing ourselves. We cling to our opinions, our memories, our self-descriptions, our accumulated evidence that we exist and matter and have a particular shape in the world, because somewhere underneath all of that clinging is the terror that without it there would be nothing, that the self is a performance that must be continuously maintained or it will simply stop. But consider what this actually means. It means you are frightened of losing something that cannot be lost. It means you are defending a territory that has never been under threat. It means the guard at the gate is protecting an empty room from an imaginary burglar, and has been doing so with tremendous dedication and absolutely no days off for as long as you can remember. You see how the cosmic humor begins to emerge from this. It is not cruel humor. It is the kind of humor that releases something, the laughter that comes when you have been gripping something tightly for so long that when you finally open your hand, you cannot quite believe you were holding on at all. So when the question asks, do you disappear when you stop thinking? The silence has already answered. Not by saying anything, by being so obviously, so irrefutably, so quietly here, that the question begins to seem like asking whether the ocean disappears when a wave subsides. The wave was the ocean doing something, and the stillness after is the ocean being what it always was. You are not the wave. You are not even the stillness. You are the water, and water, you may have noticed, does not require a label to be wet. There is a temptation at this point in the conversation to feel that something has been resolved, that we have traveled together from the question to the answer, from confusion to clarity, from the noise of the thinking mind to the peaceful ground underneath it. And if you feel that if there is a sense of arrival, of having understood something, I want to gently suggest that you hold that feeling loosely. Not because it is wrong, but because the koan does not end when the lecture ends. It goes home with you. It sits with you at dinner. It wakes with you at 3 in the morning when the voice starts up again about something you said 6 years ago that you cannot stop replaying. And in that moment, in the most ordinary, unglamorous, thoroughly human moment of lying in the dark with a restless mind, the question is still alive, still asking, still pointing at the same thing it was always pointing at. Because here is what I want you to understand about a koan. It is not a puzzle. Puzzles have solutions. And once you have the solution, The puzzle is finished, you put it in a drawer and move on to the next one. A koan is not like that. A koan is more like a thorn that the tradition places in your shoe, not to cause suffering, but to make you walk differently, to make every step a reminder. The question when you stop thinking, do you disappear or appear, is not asking you to produce a correct answer and file it away. It is asking you to notice something that is happening continuously, beneath and behind and through every moment of your ordinary life. It is asking you to become curious about the awareness that is reading these words right now, not curious about what it thinks about itself, but curious about the sheer fact of it. The bare, astonishing fact that there is something it is like to be you in this moment, without any particular story about what that means. And what happens when you become genuinely curious about that, not intellectually curious, not curious in the way that produces more thoughts about consciousness, but quietly, openly, almost vulnerably curious is less than hashon. 2,5 hash is greater than is, that the question begins to change its nature. It stops feeling like a problem to be solved and starts feeling like an invitation into a dimension of your own experience that has been available your entire life and that you have been too busy narrating to actually inhabit. The Zen teacher Dogen wrote in the 13th century that to study the self is to forget the self, and to forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. Now, do not let the word enlightened send you off into fantasies of robes and incense and permanent bliss. He means something extraordinarily practical. He means that when you stop insisting on the maintenance of this separate, defended, continuously narrated self, the world rushes in, not as a threat, as a gift, as the simple, stunning recognition that the trees and the light and the sound of rain and the warmth of another person's presence were never actually outside you, that the boundary was always more like a membrane than a wall, and that what is on both sides of a membrane is essentially the same substance in different forms. So take the question with you. Not as a burden, not as homework, not as something you must figure out before you are allowed to feel at peace. Take it the way you might take a smooth stone in your pocket, not to study it constantly, but to feel it occasionally, to be reminded by its weight and its coolness that there is something here worth being quietly attentive to. The next time the voice pauses, even for a second, even in the gap between one thought and the next, do not rush to fill it. Do not congratulate yourself for the gap, or analyze its quality, or wonder whether you are doing it correctly. Simply notice what is already there in the silence, waiting with the patience of something that has never needed to go anywhere. Notice that you are still here, that awareness is still here, that the world is still here, luminous and immediate and entirely unconcerned with whether you have named it properly. And notice, if you can, without immediately turning the noticing into a thought, about the noticing that this is not a diminished version of experience. This is experience before it has been reduced to a description of itself. This is the ocean before the wave decided it was separate from the water. You do not need to stop thinking to find this. That is the final turn of the koan, and perhaps the most liberating one. The thinking itself arises within the silence. The voice itself speaks from the ground of awareness. Even the most frantic, most exhausting, most circular interior monologue is happening inside something that is utterly still. The storm and the sky are not two different things. One is the activity of the other. And the sky does not become more sky by making the storm stop. It simply is what it is, with or without weather, with or without the voice, with or without any of the extraordinary noise of being a conscious creature alive in a universe that nobody fully understands. You are that sky. You have always been that sky. And the question was never really asking whether you disappear. It was asking whether you had noticed yet that you were never only the clouds. And so we arrive not at an ending, but at an opening. Because that is what genuine inquiry does when it is followed all the way to its source. It does not close, it opens. It does not deliver you to a destination. It reveals that you were never in transit to begin with. You are going to walk out of this conversation and the voice will start up again. Of course it will. It is extraordinarily good at what it does, and that is fine. The voice is not the enemy. It is one of the most beautiful instruments that nature has ever produced. This capacity to fold experience back on itself, to think about thinking, to ask questions about questions. But perhaps now, occasionally, there will be a moment where you hear it begin and you recognize it for what it is, not as the totality of who you are, but as one movement within something much more spacious, a wave, arising from water that was always calm underneath. The koan does not end. It simply becomes quieter, more patient, more at home in the body of your daily life. And one ordinary morning, perhaps when the light comes through a window at an angle you have seen 1,000 times before, the question and the silence and the awareness and the you that was asking will all be recognizably, unmistakably the same thing. Not because you figured it out, but because you finally stopped long enough to notice that you never needed to.